There's a place He comes to me. Though I'm blind, He helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see Him face to face.
This is Kurt Kaikkonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Face to Face, we'll be in the book of Genesis. So grab your Bibles and let's get started. If you want to hear this complete message in its entirety, go to yourneighborhoodchurch.com, where you can download Your Neighborhood Church app at the App Store. So last week, we ended with this first family not really doing that well. Their first son, Cain, in who they had put all their hope, he murdered the second son, Abel. And so basically, Adam and Eve, they lost both of their sons. They lost Cain to wandering, and then they lost Abel to death. And so it wasn't really a real good start for man. There was a lot of heartache. And so now we have Cain, and he's living in the land of Nod, which means wandering. And although he's supposed to be a vagabond, he doesn't really obey God's command here, and he builds a city. And he names this city after who he thinks is going to be his great hope, who's going to be his legacy. And he names the city Enoch after his son. And the name Enoch means consecrated. But here what we have is we have the story of two totally different families. And this is two lines that stem from Adam and Eve. We have this worldly, ungodly line of Cain, and then we have this righteous, godly line of Seth. And this line of Cain, which is worldly, it's built on the pride of men. And in this line of Seth, well, it's built on the line of promise. That promise that seed of Eve would come, where the Messiah would come through. And the first family line that the Bible deals with is this line of Cain. And the Bible doesn't follow Cain's line very long. Even though Cain, he was a murderer, I wouldn't go and assume that everybody in his line was any more evil than the people in the line of Seth. And the same the other way, that all those in the line of Seth were any more godly than some of the people in the line of Cain, because they were all fallen. And we see that from the very beginning that this corruption is inherited into all men, and it affects all of us. And with these two lines given, we can see a lot of similarities and we can see a lot of differences. And one of the similarities that we see right off the bat is the names. In Cain's line and in Seth's line, they both have children with the name Enoch, and they both have children with the name Lamech. And then the other names that are mentioned, they're very, very similar with very similar spellings. And as we go through Cain's line, it never mentions how long anybody lives. But what is mentioned is some of their wives. In Seth's line, it never mentions anyone's wife, but we have the ages of how old the men were when they had their child that would be in the line. And then we have how long that man actually lived. And even in Seth's line, it doesn't follow all the descendants. It only follows one line of descendants because it's only going to follow the people that lead to Noah. And that's because that's the line that'll lead to Christ. And that's also our line. We all came from Noah, and we came from his children. And the first person that we find that's of interest in this line of Cain is this man named Lamech. And Lamech, he's the very first bigamist. He was a polygamist. He had more than one wife. He had two wives, which was never an intent for man. And we know this because of the command that God had given to Adam and Eve about becoming one flesh. But even though God had given that command, we see throughout the Bible that God allowed it, but it was never his intent. And he reinforces one man, one wife throughout the whole Bible. And you can read that about elders in the church even, that they weren't supposed to be polygamous because polygamy was still, around during the days of Jesus and the days of Paul. And you can kind of see what Lamech thought was valuable by the names of his wives. His first wife, Ada, she means pleasure. That's what her name means, or beauty. And that kind of leads us to believe that Ada was probably some kind of trophy wife. And through this Ada, she had 2 very prosperous children. And then through his other wife, he had 1 prosperous child. And the first one was Jabal. And it says that he was the father of those who live in tents and who have livestock. And so in our modern world, we would call him a builder. He'd be a builder of homes, he'd be a builder of communities, and he would also be considered a developer of agriculture. And so you can see that his life probably had a lot to do with commerce and markets and marketing. It was business. And then you have Jubal, which was Jabal's brother. And this is the first beginning of that we see of cute names, where people would name their kids with these silly names. Jubal and Jabal, why don't you come here? It's time for dinner. Jubal, Jabal. But Jubal, he basically was the father or the leader of those in the entertainment industry, because it says he was the father of all those who played harps and flutes. So I kind of see him as kind of a Quincy Jones of his day. And then through Zillah, he had a son named Tubal-Cain. And he was kind of a leader of industry and manufacturing, because he was an instructor in craftsmen in bronze and in iron. And so you can see he would have been a manufacturer of machinery and of weapons. And all 3 of these sons are leaders in the world. And those are the same areas that our world, that we esteem really highly. They're the things that deal with wealth, they deal with economy, and they deal with prosperity. And there's no way we should really ever think of these people of being some kind of primitive man or some kind of caveman. They weren't people less developed than ourselves. They were probably smarter than us. One reason is because they lived longer. They had a lot more time to learn things. And their genes haven't deteriorated. The DNA was much more pure back then. But there's one thing you really don't see in Lamech's life, and you don't see a spiritual life. You don't see any calling on the name of God. And we realize that Cain, the father of all these kids, that he walked away from God. And he didn't lead his family into the things of God. And that's because you can't really lead people into things that you don't have yourself. So if you want to have a godly family, then you need to be godly. All right, so we have this guy, his name's Lamech. He's a bigamist. He has 3 prosperous sons in the world. And then we find out that he's a murderer. And he's just like his great-great-grandfather Cain, except that Lamech, he kills 2 men, and he says it was for hurting them. But his logic is twisted, because he knows the story of Cain, but he believes that Cain was avenged for his murdering. And so he says that he should be avenged 7 times more than Cain because he killed 2 men. And so we end this line of Lamech, and now we go back to these broken-hearted people, Adam and Eve, and they're probably pretty disappointed with Cain and his family. And now they're going to have another son. And this son, Eve names Seth. And Seth means appointed. And Eve's the one who tells us, hey, this is Abel's replacement, because she realizes now that promised seed was not going to come through Cain, and it wasn't going to come through Cain's line, which she originally hoped. But Eve is still placing her faith in God's promise, but now she's placing it through this son, Seth. And she's absolutely right. And you have to realize these parents had a lot of heartache with their children. They didn't have a really easy life since the fall. And we find that we share these same kinds of heartaches. And if we don't personally, we know families that have these same kind of heartaches where they lose children and they lose children to the world and things don't quite turn out, that they had a lot of hope, but all those hopes were dashed. Things started out pretty good and they kind of turned. And so now we start chapter 4, and it says that men start to call on the name of the Lord. And that name there for the Lord again here is Yahweh. So they're calling on the real God. And you kind of have to wonder, well, why did they ever stop? They're so close to the beginning. Adam and Eve have been around. They must have heard the stories. And we're reminded that Adam, that he himself, that he was made in the likeness of God. But then it tells us that his children aren't, that they're made in his likeness, that they're in the likeness of Adam. And what that means is that Adam's children were fallen. Because if you remember when we talked about Adam being made in the likeness of God, we weren't talking that he was physically made like God, but that he was spiritually made like God. Because Adam's body, it was just made of dirt, like our bodies are made of dirt. And so the spiritual likeness of Adam's children, they were made in the spiritual fallen nature, just like Adam. And that's the way it's been through all humanity. We've all been fallen. And we can see that nature passed on and passed on and passed on until you get to the birth of Jesus. And then again, Jesus is in the likeness of God. And that's because Jesus is God. Okay, so we look at these pre-flood days, and we look at these long lives where people lived for almost 1,000 years, but there were two exceptions. And one of the exceptions was Seth's Enoch, who only lived for 365 years, but he didn't die, he was taken. And then we have Lamech, also from Seth, which was Noah's dad, and he only lived to 777 years, but he also died before the flood. And before the flood, everything was different. Like we mentioned, that there was a barrier in the sky that probably filtered out a lot of the cosmic rays and the radiation. And it's believed that the earth probably wasn't tilted on its axis back then, and there was probably only a 360-day year. But at that time of the flood, that there were dramatic changes in the earth, but the only thing that didn't change was man's wickedness. That stayed the same. And because of the long lifespans, some have calculated that there could have been up to 7 billion people on the earth before the flood.
You've been listening to Face to Face. Face to Face on this radio station has been provided by Your Neighborhood Church. If you want to help support Face to Face and put this program on other stations just like yours, you can contact us at yourneighborhoodchurch.com or write Your Neighborhood Church, P.O. Box 500, Romeo, Michigan 48065.
There's a place he comes to me. Though I'm blind, he helps me see. Though I see dimly in this place, one day I'll see him face to face.
Tune in again tomorrow at this same time as we continue to go through the Bible.